In 1984, one of the most beloved car brands in American history just stopped existing. Not because of a recall, not because of a bankruptcy, because some suits in Tokyo looked at a spreadsheet and decided that a name millions of people genuinely loved was an inconvenience worth $1 billion to fix. This is why Datsun changed its name to Nissan and the shocking reason behind the rebrand. A name built from initials and bad luck. The whole thing starts somewhere nobody ever expects. 1911, Tokyo, a tiny motorcar outfit called Kaishin-sha. The founder, Masujiro Hashimoto, had gone to America to study engineering, came back with big ideas, and started building small, affordable cars. The first one rolled out in 1914, and they named it the DAT, straight initials of the three investors, Den, Aoyama, Takeuchi. It also happened to mean swift or agile in Japanese. Nobody planned that. It just landed. Then, in 1931, the company went smaller and cheaper with a new model, the son of Dat. They literally called it Datsun, D-A-T-S-O-N, which, in theory, is clever wordplay. In practice, it was a disaster because in Japanese, sun also means loss. That is genuinely the last word you want attached to a product you're trying to sell. So one letter got swapped. Datsun became Datsun, the son of Dat, a nod to the rising sun of the Japanese flag. The fix worked. By 1934, the parent company had folded into what would eventually become Nissan Motor Company, but the Datsun name stayed alive for export markets. And this is the part that matters. Nobody inside that boardroom had any idea they were sitting on one of the most powerful pieces of brand equity in automotive history. They just kept the name because it was useful, which makes it even more baffling that, 50 years later, their own successors would pay hundreds of millions of dollars to destroy it. The underdog, nobody believed in. When Datsun first arrived on American shores in 1958, the reception was roughly what you'd expect for a small Japanese import during the era of massive chrome-laden V8 land yachts from Detroit. Polite dismissal. The cars were underpowered, not particularly exciting to look at by American standards, and had zero cultural credibility in a country where a car was still a statement of identity. Dealerships didn't know how to pitch them. The automotive press mostly ignored them. But Datsun had two things that American cars in that period increasingly didn't. They were cheap and they did not break. While domestics were developing rust at 2 years old and needing shop visits every other month, Datsuns just ran. The engineering was meticulous, the build quality was obsessive, and the fuel economy was so far ahead of anything coming out of Michigan that it barely even seemed like a fair comparison. Through the 1960s, Datsun quietly built its crowd. College students, young professionals, practical buyers who needed reliable transport and weren't interested in paying a premium to look impressive. That turned out to be a massive market. But the real moment, the one that changed everything, landed in 1970, the Z car that rewrote the rules. Before the 240Z, the phrase Japanese sports car didn't really exist in mainstream American consciousness. Japanese cars were economy cars. Sensible, dependable, slightly boring. The 240Z showed up and effectively told everyone to update their assumptions. The spec sheet alone was enough to create chaos. A 2.4-liter inline six, producing 151 horsepower. A roofline that looked like someone at Nissan's design team had been secretly studying Italian coach builders. The proportions were near perfect, long hood, fast back rear, a stance that made it look purposeful even sitting still. And the price? $3,426 at launch. A Jaguar E-Type, which every single magazine comparison kept referencing because the 240Z was genuinely in that league, cost nearly double. Road and Track called it the Japanese invasion of the sports car market. Sports Car Graphic handed it one of the most glowing reviews any car had received in years. Over 16,000 units sold in America in the first full year alone. By 1975, the cumulative US total was north of 150,000. The Z didn't just move metal, it fundamentally repositioned what the Datsun name meant. It wasn't the brand for practical people anymore. It was the brand for people with taste who happened to have financial sense. That combination is essentially impossible to manufacture with marketing. You either have it or you don't. Datsun had it. which is exactly why what came next still stings. The oil crisis made them bulletproof. 1973. Oil embargo didn't just raise gas prices. It effectively ended an entire era of American automotive culture in about 6 months. Gas lines stretched around city blocks, prices quadrupled. The muscle car, which had been coasting on cheap fuel and cultural momentum, basically evaporated. Buyers who had never once considered a small import were suddenly very interested in fuel economy figures. Datsun was already there, had been there for years. While American cars were limping to 12 miles per gallon, Datsuns were doing 30. The timing was so perfect it almost seemed staged. Sales didn't just grow, they compounded. By the late 1970s, Datsun was moving over 500,000 units annually in the United States. They had passed Toyota, they had passed Volkswagen, they were the single biggest import brand in America. The name was everywhere: billboards, racing circuits, bumper stickers on cars that had racked up 200,000 miles and still wouldn't quit. Datsun clubs were forming across the country. Actual communities of owners who identified with the brand the way people identify with sports teams. The kind of emotional connection that companies spend decades and fortunes trying to engineer had happened organically. And at the exact peak of all this, with the brand's equity at its absolute highest and the loyalty running deepest, someone in Tokyo decided it was time to make a change. The most expensive bad idea in automotive history. By 1980, Nissan's executive team had a problem that was real, but not the kind that required the solution they chose. In Japan, the cars sold under the Nissan name. In America and most export markets, they were Datsuns. In a handful of countries, both names showed up simultaneously. From a purely organizational standpoint, this was messy. From a customer standpoint, it was completely invisible because nobody in Ohio buying their third Datsun pickup was thinking about Nissan's global brand architecture. The internal logic wasn't entirely unreasonable on paper. A unified global identity reduces marketing complexity. One name is easier to build worldwide recognition around than two. Long-term, the efficiency gains could be significant. This is the kind of argument that sounds clean in a presentation and absolutely falls apart when it meets actual human beings with actual brand loyalty. Here's the part that makes the whole thing genuinely maddening. Nissan commissioned research before making the decision. That research showed Datsun at 85% brand recognition among American car buyers. Nissan sat at roughly 2%. They read those numbers, they understood what they meant, and they went ahead anyway. The announcement came in 1981. Over a 3-year period, every Datsun badge in America would be replaced with a Nissan badge. The marketing campaign designed to explain this transition to confused customers, the one that essentially had to tell millions of loyal buyers that the brand they loved had been renamed to something they'd never heard of, cost somewhere between $200 million and $500 million, depending on which estimates you trust. Some analysts who tracked the full picture, including lost sales and eroded market share, have put the total economic damage at over $1 billion. To replace a beloved name with an unknown one, the fallout was exactly what you'd expect. Dealerships started fielding it immediately. Where's the Datsun inventory? Is Nissan a different company? What happened? Sales staff were doing improvised crisis communication that nobody prepared them for. Customers who had purchased multiple Datsuns in a row and had zero complaints about the product started avoiding the new Nissan badge cars purely because the name was unfamiliar. Some assumed the brand had been sold. Some assumed quality had dropped. Some just felt, correctly, that something they were loyal to had been taken away from them without asking. Between 1982 and 1987, Nissan's US market share dropped somewhere between 20 and 30%. Toyota, which kept its name, kept growing. Honda, which kept its name, kept growing. The brands stumbling in that window were the ones introducing confusion where none needed to exist. Takashi Ishihara, the Nissan president who had championed the name change, retired in 1985. He handed the problem to the people who came after him, who spent years trying to rebuild brand recognition that had already existed and been voluntarily discarded. What the sales figures don't fully communicate is the cultural damage. Datsun clubs didn't rebadge themselves into Nissan clubs. The Z car community, the guys who had built entire garages around 240Z and 280Z ownership, didn't transfer their aura to the new name automatically. That community had been built around a specific identity, and you can't relocate an identity with new signage. What Nissan spent $1 billion to destroy, they then spent 15 years trying to painstakingly reconstruct from scratch. The ghost that wouldn't stay buried. In 2012, nearly 30 years after the Datsun name was officially retired, Nissan brought it back. Not in America. In India, Indonesia, and Russia, budget markets where first-time car buyers needed a lower-priced entry point below the main Nissan lineup. The pitch was a dedicated, low-cost brand, separate from the more premium Nissan range. Take a moment to absorb what this actually represents. After decades of insisting the Datsun name needed to go, after spending an amount of money that still makes analysts wince to bury it, Nissan's own executives concluded the name retained enough dormant equity to be commercially useful in new markets. That's not a strategic pivot. That's an accidental admission that they were wrong the first time. The revival never found traction. Sales underperformed in every market. By 2022, Nissan quietly shuttered the Datsun brand for the second and presumably final time. What survived the corporate death, both times, was the community that never needed permission to keep existing. The 240Z, 260Z, 280Z are legitimate classics now, worth multiples of their original price. Restoration clubs are active. Collectors pour serious money into keeping original Datsun trucks and sedans in correct, period-accurate condition. The brand that Nissan thought they could retire with a memo in 1981 has been maintained entirely by the people who loved it, operating entirely outside any corporate structure. What a spreadsheet can't measure. The Datsun story gets taught in business programs now, and not as a success case. The executives who made this call were not incompetent. Global brand consistency is a legitimate strategic objective. Marketing efficiency matters. Long-term identity clarity is genuinely valuable. None of that reasoning was invented. It just got applied somewhere that required a more human understanding of what was actually at stake. Brand loyalty is not a resource you can redirect. When someone had driven nothing but Datsuns for 15 years and told every person they knew to buy one, they weren't just describing a purchasing habit. They were describing an identity, a relationship, something that felt, on some level, theirs. You cannot transfer that feeling to a new name with a campaign and some new dealership signage, no matter how much money you put behind it. The Nissan Z today, 7th generation, genuinely excellent car, carries the bloodline of the 240Z that made the whole brand matter in the first place. The engineering lineage is intact, and the current team has honored it properly. But there is a version of this history where Datsun never got killed, where the brand loyalty kept compounding for 4 more decades, where none of that money went to damage control and all of it went into engineering and growth. That version of events is probably the most expensive road not taken in the history of the automotive industry, and every business school student studying brand management gets to inherit the lesson for free.